I didn't realize my daughter had been taken from me until the day I couldn't afford my own medication, but she was out laughing over dinner, saying she didn't have to worry about money anymore. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that I knew could never be undone. I had trusted her. I had helped her. And somewhere along the way, I had become the one being used. I just didn't see it until it was too late. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in the same wooden house near the coast of Charleston, South Carolina for more than 4 decades. The house sits just far enough from the shoreline that I can hear the ocean when the wind is right. A steady rhythm that has outlasted almost everything else in my life. I became a widow 3 years ago. My husband, Thomas, died quietly in his sleep after a long struggle with his heart. Since then, the house has felt larger than it used to, as if the walls themselves had stretched to hold the silence he left behind. I learned to live with that silence. In some ways, I even depended on it. My days follow a pattern that rarely changes. I wake before the sun rises, make a cup of black coffee, and sit by the kitchen window where the light comes in first. After that, I step outside to tend to the small garden Thomas and I planted years ago. It is not much, just a few flowers and some herbs, but it gives me something to care for. By mid-morning, I am back inside, somewhere to see, reading the newspaper, or organizing small things around the house that no one else would notice. I live on a fixed pension and a modest amount of savings. It is enough. I have always been careful with money, and I take a quiet pride in not needing to rely on anyone. My life is simple, but it is mine, and for a long time, that was enough to make me feel steady. What I did not expect was how the quiet would begin to feel different after Thomas was gone. It was no longer shared. It pressed in around me, especially in the evenings, when the light faded and there was no one to speak to. I did not complain about it. I accepted it, the way you accept the tide going in and out. My daughter Rachel lives in Atlanta. Before her father passed, we did not see each other often. Our relationship had always been polite but distant, shaped more by obligation than closeness. But after the funeral, something changed. She began visiting more frequently, sometimes twice in the same week. At first, I did not question it. She would arrive with grocery bags in her hands or takeout containers balanced carefully as she stepped through the front door. She moved through the house with an ease that surprised me, opening cabinets, setting things down, making herself comfortable in ways she never had before. She cooked meals I did not ask for, fixed small things that had been broken for months, and sat with me at the table longer than I expected. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, her work, memories of her father. Sometimes we did not say much at all, but even that felt different from being alone. I found myself looking forward to those visits. The house felt warmer when she was there, less like a place holding on to the past, and more like something still alive. I did not realize how quickly I began to depend on that feeling. There were moments, small ones, when I noticed how naturally she moved through my space, as if it already belonged to her. I told myself it was nothing. After all, she was my daughter. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe something between us was finally being repaired. If you're still watching, and this story is starting to resonate with you, comment number 1 below, so I know you're here with me. Something subtle has already begun to shift, and what comes next will change everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. That morning began like most others. I woke before sunrise, made my coffee, and sat by the kitchen window as the light slowly spread across the yard. The ocean breeze carried a faint salt smell through the open window, and for a while, everything felt steady, predictable, and safe. By late morning, I was in the garden trimming back a few overgrown branches when I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I did not need to look up to know it was Rachel. She had been coming often enough that the sound had already become part of my routine. I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped inside just as the front door opened. She walked in with a small smile, but something about her felt different that day. She did not carry any groceries or food, and she did not move toward the kitchen like she usually did. Instead, she stayed near the doorway, her keys still in her hand, her eyes moving quickly around the room as if she were measuring something. I asked how she was, and she answered, but her voice seemed more focused than usual, less relaxed. She did not sit down right away. That was the first thing that made me pause, though I could not explain why. After a moment, she stepped further into the room and leaned lightly against the counter. She took a breath before speaking, and I could tell she had already decided what she was going to say before she arrived. She told me she had been thinking about starting something of her own, a small nail salon, something stable that could give her independence. She explained it in a way that sounded reasonable, almost practiced. Then she said she needed help to get started. The number came next, $1,000. I did not respond immediately. I looked at her, trying to understand not just what she was asking, but what it meant. It was not a small amount for me, but it was not impossible either. I felt a brief hesitation, a quiet voice reminding me that I lived on a fixed income, that I needed to be careful. But that voice did not stay long. It was quickly replaced by something else. She was my daughter. If she was trying to build something, should I not support that? She told me it was temporary, just until things were running. She said she would pay me back within a month. Her tone was steady, confident, almost reassuring. I nodded before I had fully thought it through. I went to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept some emergency cash. The envelope was exactly where I always left it. I counted the money slowly, feeling each bill between my fingers, aware that this was more than just a simple favor. When I returned to the kitchen, she was standing in the same place. I handed her the money, and for a moment, our hands touched. It was brief, but something about it felt like a line had been crossed. She thanked me, and I could see the tension in her shoulders ease. She stayed a little longer after that, long enough to talk about small things, to make it feel like the visit had not been about the money. When she left, the house returned to its usual quiet, but it did not feel the same. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from her, promising again that she would pay me back next month. I read it more than once, letting the words settle. Before she left earlier, she had said something that lingered in my mind. She had told me that I would always have my pension. At the time, I took it as reassurance. Now, sitting alone in the quiet house, I realized it sounded more like certainty. Still, I told myself this was just one time. If you're still watching and you can feel that something isn't quite right, comment number 2 below to let me know you're paying attention. What seemed like a simple favor is about to become a pattern. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. The second time Rachel came for money, it did not feel like a separate event. It felt like a continuation of something that had already been decided. A few weeks had passed since the first time, long enough for me to settle back into my routine, but not long enough to forget the envelope in the drawer had grown thinner. I told myself I would wait and see if she followed through on her promise before thinking too much about it. When I heard her car pull into the driveway that afternoon, I already had a sense of what the visit might become. She walked in without knocking this time. There was no hesitation in her movement, no pause to take in the room the way she used to. She placed her keys on the counter as if she had done it every day of her life, then turned toward me with a brief smile. She did not sit down. She told me she needed a little more help that month. Her voice was steady, but there was less effort in it now, less care in how the words were arranged. The explanation was shorter, less detailed. Something about expenses not lining up, about needing to cover a gap. Then she said the amount, $2,000. I felt the difference immediately, not just in the number, but in the way it was delivered. It was no longer a request that needed careful explanation. It sounded like something that simply had to be handled. I asked why it was more than before. The question came out softer than I intended, almost like I was apologizing for asking it at all. She gave an answer, but it did not settle anything. It was vague, quick, and already moving past the point. She told me it was temporary, just until things stabilized. I stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar pull between hesitation and responsibility. I thought about my account, about the balance I had checked just the night before. I thought about how I would need to move things around, maybe rely on my credit card for a while. But none of those thoughts stayed long enough to change my decision. I went to the bedroom, opened the drawer, and took out what she asked for. When I handed it to her, the exchange felt quicker, quieter. She thanked me, but her relief came faster this time, like she had expected the outcome all along. She did not stay long after that. The third time came sooner than I expected. It had only been a couple of weeks when I heard her car again. This time, I felt it before I saw it, a kind of tightening in my chest that I could not ignore. She stepped inside, and I noticed immediately that she did not even pretend to settle in. She stayed near the door, her body angled as if she was already preparing to leave. She said she was short again. Then she told me the amount, $3,000. I did not move right away. For the first time, I said something. I reminded her that she had not paid me back from before. She responded quickly, almost before I finished speaking. She said she would take care of everything soon, that it was all happening at once, that I just needed to give her a little more time. There was a sharpness in her tone now, something impatient, as if the conversation itself was unnecessary. I gave it to her. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a small notebook. I wrote down the date, the amount, and a short note beside it. Then I turned back a page and added the previous ones, making sure everything was clear. My handwriting looked more careful than usual, each number precise. I began checking my account more often after that. I noticed how quickly the numbers were changing, how I had started using my credit card to cover things I once paid for without thinking. When Rachel came again, the visits were shorter. There were no meals, no long conversations, no questions about how I was doing. It became something we both seemed to understand without saying. And slowly, without ever deciding to, I started expecting it. By the time I heard her car, I already knew what she would say. It was no longer about helping. It was becoming something else. If you're still watching and starting to see where this is going, comment number 3 below, so I know you're with me. The line between helping and being used is about to blur even more. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. The changes in my life did not arrive all at once. They came quietly, in small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. I did not wake up one morning and realize something was wrong. Instead, I adjusted little by little until those adjustments became my new normal. At the grocery store, I started choosing differently. I would stand in the aisle longer than I used to, comparing prices, calculating totals in my head. Items I once placed in my basket without thinking were now returned to the shelf. Fresh fruit became something I bought less often. Meat, something I stretched across more meals than before. I told myself it was temporary. When I picked up my prescriptions, I hesitated. One refill became 2 weeks late, then longer. I convinced myself that missing a few days would not matter. I had always been careful with my health, but now I was careful with something else. I did not connect these changes to Rachel right away, at least not fully. It was easier to believe I was simply being cautious. The next time she came, there was no question about why she was there. She walked in, glanced around briefly, and stood near the counter. She said she needed help again. There was no explanation this time, only the number. It was said quickly, as if the details were unnecessary. I did not respond immediately. I felt something different in that moment, something heavier than hesitation. It was a quiet resistance, a sense that I was being pulled further into something I did not understand. I asked her why it kept happening. She answered, but her words felt practiced, detached. She said things were complicated, that she did not have anyone else to rely on, that she would fix everything soon. There was a shift in her tone when she added that last part. It carried a hint of pressure, as if my decision was already expected. I stood there, holding on to that moment longer than I had before. Then I went to the bedroom. When I handed her the money, I felt the weight of it more than ever, not just in the amount, but in what it meant. She took it quickly, her expression easing, and within minutes, she was gone. The house felt emptier after she left. A few days later, I went to the pharmacy. The pharmacist looked at her screen, then back at me, her expression tightening slightly. She told me I had missed my last refill. I nodded and told her I would come back soon. I did not. That afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen when it happened. A sudden wave of dizziness moved through me, sharp and unexpected. I reached for the counter, but my hand did not feel steady. My legs weakened, and before I could catch myself, I was sitting on the floor. I stayed there longer than I meant to. The room felt distant, like something I was watching instead of being inside. I focused on my breathing, waiting for the feeling to pass. Slowly, it did, but not completely. When I finally stood up, I moved carefully, aware of how easily things could change. That was the moment I understood something I had been avoiding. Rachel did not know what I was giving up. She did not know about the groceries I left behind or the medication I delayed. She did not see the way I had started measuring everything, not just in dollars, but in what I could afford to lose. And I had never told her. That evening, I sat at the table with my notebook. I flipped through the pages, reading each entry, each number written in careful handwriting. Then I looked at the most recent one. For the first time, I saw it not as a record, but as a pattern. The letter from the bank sat unopened nearby. I had already seen enough to understand what it meant. My balance was shifting in ways I could no longer ignore. I had crossed a line somewhere. I just did not know when it happened or how far I had gone. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of these choices, comment number 4 below to let me know you're still here. Because what happens next is the moment everything becomes impossible to ignore. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. The dizziness did not disappear completely after that afternoon in the kitchen. It lingered in small ways, a quiet reminder that my body was no longer as steady as I believed. I moved more carefully after that, holding on to counters a little longer, pausing before standing up too quickly. I told myself I was fine, but I no longer trusted that feeling the way I used to. A few days later, I decided to try a different grocery store across town. I had heard it was cheaper, and lately that mattered more than convenience. The store was smaller, less organized, and carried fewer options than the one I used to visit. The lighting was harsher, and the aisles felt narrower, but I adjusted to it quickly. I carried a small basket instead of using a cart. It helped me limit what I bought: bread, eggs, a few canned goods. I picked up a package of fruit, held it for a moment, then put it back. I had already done the math in my head. As I stood in line, waiting quietly, I heard a voice that made me turn before I could stop myself. It was Rachel. The sound of her voice came from outside, across the street, where a restaurant sat with large front windows facing the road. I shifted slightly, just enough to see without being seen. She was sitting at a table near the window, dressed in a way I had not seen in months. Her posture was relaxed, her movements easy. She leaned back in her chair as she spoke, her hands moving freely, her expression open and bright. There were two other people with her. They were laughing at something she said, and she laughed with them, a full, effortless sound that carried even through the glass. I stayed where I was, watching. There was no tension in her face, no sign of worry. Nothing about her suggested that she was struggling to get by. She looked comfortable, certain, completely at ease in a way I had not seen in a long time. Then the server brought the check. Rachel reached for it without hesitation. She did not look at the total for long. She signed it quickly, as if it did not matter. One of the people at the table said something, and she responded with a small shrug and a smile. She said she was fine, that everything was covered, that she did not need to stress about money anymore. I felt something inside me go quiet. I looked down at the basket in my hands. It suddenly felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was in it, but because of everything I had left behind. When I looked back up, she was still smiling. I stepped out of line without buying anything. No one stopped me. No one noticed. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the air cooler than it had been inside. I watched from a distance as the conversation continued, as if I needed to be sure of what I had seen. There was no misunderstanding. I turned and walked back to my car. The drive home felt longer than usual. I did not rush. I did not cry. I simply let the silence fill the space around me, but it no longer felt the same as it once had. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. I opened it slowly and began to read each entry from the beginning. Every date, every amount, every line written in careful ink. When I reached the last page, I added the numbers together for the first time. I stopped when I saw the total. It was more than I had allowed myself to imagine. I sat there for a long time staring at it. For months, I had told myself I was helping her. Now, I could no longer say that. For the first time, I stopped trying to explain it away. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Rachel sitting by that window laughing without hesitation, reaching for the check as if it meant nothing. The ease in her voice stayed with me more than anything else. It was not just what she said, it was how certain she sounded. By morning, I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had not touched. The light came in through the window like it always did, but it felt different. The room felt sharper, clearer, as if something had been removed. I opened my notebook again, not because I needed to check the numbers, but because I needed to see them one more time. They did not change. The total was still there, steady and undeniable. For the first time, I did not try to soften what it meant. When I heard Rachel's car later that day, I did not feel the same quiet dread I had come to expect. Instead, there was something else, a kind of stillness that held me in place. She walked in like she always did, moving toward the counter without hesitation. I spoke before she could. I asked her to sit down. She paused, just for a second, as if the request did not fit the pattern she was used to. Then she sat, but not fully. Her posture stayed tense, her body angled toward the door. I told her I had been going through my records. I said the amount out loud. She reacted immediately. Her expression tightened, and she leaned back slightly, as if creating distance from the words themselves. She said she had already explained everything, that things were complicated, that I just needed to be patient. I listened without interrupting. Then I told her what I had not said before. I told her about the groceries I had stopped buying, about the medication I had delayed, about the way I had started measuring everything just to keep up with what I was giving her. She shook her head before I finished. She said I was making it sound worse than it was. She said I was overreacting, that I did not understand how difficult things were for her right now. There was a sharpness in her voice that I had not heard before. It was not defensive. It was dismissive. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply stayed where I was and looked at her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stood up. She said she could not deal with this right now. She said if I was going to start keeping track like that, then maybe she should not come by at all. She turned toward the door. I said her name once. She did not stop. The door closed behind her, and the sound echoed through the house in a way that felt final. I remained at the table for a long time after she left. The notebook was still open in front of me, but I was no longer looking at it. Something had changed in that moment. I understood then that this was not something I could fix by explaining myself better or waiting for her to see what she was doing. The conversation had not brought clarity. It had made the truth clearer. I was not being misunderstood. I was being ignored. That afternoon, I sat with my phone in my hand longer than I needed to. There was one name I had not called in years, but it stayed in my mind with a quiet certainty. Margaret Lewis. She had helped my husband and me with legal matters before. She was someone I trusted, someone who dealt in facts instead of... I hesitated before dialing. Once I made that call, there would be no going back to what things had been. I pressed the number anyway. When she answered, I told her I needed help. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had made a decision I would not undo. If you're still watching, and you felt that turning point, comment number 6 below so I know you're with me. The decision has been made, but the consequences are just beginning. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The house felt different after Rachel left that day. It was quiet, but not in the way I had grown used to. Before, the silence had been something I lived with, something that settled around me like a familiar blanket. Now it felt sharper, more defined, as if it was waiting for me to notice it. Days passed without her coming back. At first, I found myself listening for the sound of her car out of habit. I would pause in the middle of something, expecting to hear it, then realize the driveway remained empty. That absence carried a strange weight. Part of me felt relief, a kind of space I had not allowed myself before. Another part felt something closer to grief. I thought about her often during those days, not the version of her I had seen at the restaurant, or the one who stood in my kitchen asking for money, but the version I remembered from years ago. The child who used to run through this house, who once needed me in ways that felt simple and clear. I tried to understand when that had changed. The answer never came in a single moment. It felt like something that had shifted slowly, without either of us noticing until it was too far gone to ignore. Physically, I still felt the effects of the past weeks. I moved more carefully around the house, aware of how easily my balance could slip. There were moments when I would pause in the middle of a room, just to steady myself, reminding myself to take things slowly. Living alone had never frightened me before. Now, I began to think about it differently. I noticed the locks on the doors more than I used to. I checked them twice before going to bed. I thought about what would happen if I fell again, if I could not reach the phone, if no one came by for days. Those thoughts did not come all at once. They settled in gradually, becoming part of the way I moved through the house. I sat down one afternoon and reviewed my finances carefully. I went through my bank statements, my credit card balances, and the notes I had written in my notebook. Seeing everything laid out in front of me made it impossible to ignore. The numbers told a clear story. I had not just given money. I had rearranged my entire life around those decisions. I had delayed my health, limited my food, and put my own stability at risk. That realization did not bring anger the way I expected. It brought clarity. For the first time that I stopped calling it help. I sat at the table and gathered everything I had: the notebook, the bank statements, the messages on my phone, and the letter about the loan that carried my name. I arranged them carefully, one beside the other. The process felt steady, almost grounding. Each piece of paper was a fact. Each number was something I could not change, but could finally acknowledge. I understood now what this was. It had a name. It was not confusion or misunderstanding. It was exploitation. That word stayed with me longer than anything else. I did not say it out loud, but I no longer pushed it away. As I closed the folder and set it in front of me, I felt something settle into place. The uncertainty that had followed me for months was gone. What remained was not comfort, but something stronger. I was ready to face what came next. The morning began with a stillness I had not felt in a long time. Not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that settles when something has already been decided. I woke earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because I no longer needed to avoid the day ahead. The folder sat on the kitchen table where I had left it the night before. I opened it once more, not to check anything new, but to steady myself. Each document was in place: the notebook, the bank statements, the printed messages, the loan notice with my name on it. Everything was clear, organized, and impossible to dismiss. When Margaret Lewis arrived, she carried herself with the same calm confidence I remembered from years ago. She greeted me warmly, but there was a focus in her expression that reassured me more than any words could. She moved through the room with quiet purpose, placing her own documents beside mine, reviewing everything with careful attention. A short time later, the bank representative joined us. He explained the protections that had already been placed on my accounts, measures designed to prevent any further unauthorized activity. Hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel more real, but also more contained. We sat together at the table, waiting. When I heard Rachel's car pull into the driveway, I did not move right away. I allowed a few seconds to pass before walking to the door. It was a small decision, but it mattered. She stepped inside as she always did, but this time she stopped almost immediately. Her eyes moved from me to the table, then to the people sitting there. The shift in her expression was quick, from expectation to confusion, then to something more guarded. Margaret introduced herself in a calm, measured tone. Rachel did not respond right away. I asked her to sit down. She hesitated, then did. The documents were placed in front of her, one by one. The messages she had sent, the records of each withdrawal, the loan tied to my name. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was hidden. At first, she dismissed it. She said it was unnecessary, that this was something that should be handled privately, but the presence of others changed the weight of her words. Margaret explained the situation clearly, outlining the financial and legal implications without raising her voice. The room remained quiet, but the meaning was unmistakable. I told Rachel the total amount. I told her what it had cost me. Then I explained what would happen next. The agreement was placed in front of her. A structured repayment plan, written terms, and clear conditions. She was to return her key, stop coming without notice, and no longer ask me for money. She did not reach for the pen immediately. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret outlined what would follow if the agreement was refused. The consequences were not threats, but facts. Rachel's expression shifted again. The resistance did not disappear, but it changed shape. Slowly, she picked up the pen. Her hand moved across the paper, her signature forming with a slight tremor. When she finished, she pushed the document forward without looking at me. She stood and left without another word. The door closed behind her, and the house fell quiet once more. But this time, the silence felt different. For the first time in months, I had not given something away. If you're still watching and you've made it this far, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. Because now we're stepping into the final outcome, and nothing will be the same after this. Now let's move on to the ending. The house was quiet after Rachel left, but it no longer felt uncertain. The silence had changed. It was no longer something that pressed against me. It was something I could stand inside without hesitation. The next morning, the locksmith arrived as scheduled. He worked efficiently, moving from the front door to the back, removing the old locks that had been there for years. I stood nearby and watched, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it happen. There was something steady about the process. Each turn of the tool, each piece replaced, felt like a small correction being made. When he finished, he handed me the new key. It was lighter than I expected. I held it for a moment before placing it in my pocket. For the first time in a long while, the house felt entirely mine again. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. I moved through my routines with a different awareness. I was not waiting for anything to interrupt them. I was simply living inside them. About 2 weeks later, I noticed the first repayment. It was a transfer of $400 into my account. There was no message attached, no explanation, no acknowledgement beyond the number itself. I looked at it for a moment, then closed the screen. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. That afternoon, I went to the pharmacy. I told the pharmacist I was there to refill everything. She looked at her screen, then back at me, and gave a small nod. There was no need for further conversation. I left with what I needed. At the grocery store, I took a cart instead of a basket. I moved through the aisles without calculating every item. When I reached for something, I did not stop myself halfway. I placed it in the cart and kept walking. There was a quiet ease in that. When I returned home, I went to the drawer where I kept my notebook. I opened it and flipped through the pages one last time. The entries were still there, each one marking a moment I could not change. I closed it and set it aside. Then I took out a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote down my monthly expenses. Not what I had lost, but what I needed to maintain my life the way it should have been all along. The difference felt significant. A few days later, I met Margaret at a small cafe. We did not spend much time discussing details. She told me I had done what was necessary. I listened, but I already knew that. The decision had been the hardest part. The rest had followed. When I returned home that evening, the light coming through the windows felt softer, more familiar. I moved through the house without hesitation, without the quiet tension that had once followed me from room to room. Rachel had not contacted me again. I did not reach out either. Some things take time, but for now, I had taken back what mattered. That evening, the house was quiet, in a way I had not experienced before. The light in the living room was soft, fading slowly as the sun lowered beyond the trees. I sat in my usual chair, my hands resting loosely in my lap, and allowed myself to think back on everything that had led me here. For a long time, I believed that love meant giving without question. I thought that being a mother required a kind of quiet endurance, a willingness to step aside so that your child could move forward. I never saw that belief as a weakness. I saw it as part of who I was. Now, I understood it differently. What I had given was not just money. It had been my health, my peace, and a part of my dignity that I had not realized I was losing. I had adjusted my life around someone else's needs without asking whether those needs were real or fair. The cost of that was something I could not ignore anymore. My phone buzzed softly on the table beside me, breaking the silence just enough to draw my attention. I reached for it and saw Rachel's name on the screen. The message was short. She said she was sorry. She said she wanted to fix things. I read it once, then again. There was a time when those words would have been enough to make me respond immediately. I would have searched for the right thing to say, something that would smooth over the tension and bring us back to where we were before. But I did not do that. I set the phone down and let it rest where it was. It was not anger that stopped me. It was something quieter, something steadier. I understood now that I did not have to answer right away. I did not have to rush into forgiveness or pretend that everything could be repaired in a single moment. For the first time, I allowed myself to choose when and how I would respond. That choice felt more important than anything she had written. I looked around the room, at the familiar walls, the furniture that had not changed, the small details that had always been part of my life. Nothing here was different, and yet everything felt new. Helping someone should never require you to lose yourself. That was something I knew now, not just in thought, but in experience. I turned off the light and sat in the quiet for a moment longer. I was not waiting anymore. I was choosing. In the end, life has a quiet way of teaching what we are unwilling to face. Sometimes the hardest lessons do not come from strangers, but from the places we once felt safest. It is easy to give, to bend, to believe that love means endless sacrifice. But real strength is not found in how much we endure in silence. It is found in the moment we finally choose ourselves, without guilt, without fear. There is a difference between kindness and self-abandonment. When that line becomes clear, everything begins to change. Peace does not return all at once, but it comes back in small, steady ways. And with it comes something even more valuable: self-respect. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own boundaries and what they mean to you. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below.